In this lecture, we will explore traditional Chinese architecture. There are many different belief systems and religions that had influenced Chinese architecture, but we will focus on Confucianism and the impact of Confucian rites on the built environment of China. Individual Chinese building is rather simple. However, this simplicity allows great flexibility and versatility for Chinese architecture. And through the connection of courtyards, corridors, simple individual building can be grouped into building complex that create complicated and rather colorful, very rich spatial experience. Traditional Chinese architecture, like the ancient Chinese civilization, evolved from the Neolithic to the modern age. They are not the oldest, but they are the only unbroken civilization that directly developed from a Neolithic tradition. Like the Chinese script is the only non-alphabetic language in the world. We know that early scripts of the Egyptians and other civilizations, they all had kind of non-alphabetic pictogram and ideogram stage, but none of them continued to the modern age. But the Chinese language certainly retained that kind of early concept about, written record. The Chinese civilization evolved in the Yellow River area, so writing and organized administration, central government evolved in that area. So it is can be considered as a hydraulic civilization. The civilization, evolved from the kind of taming of a great river in the development of agriculture next to the Egyptian, the Mesopotamian, and the Indian civilizations. And also, like many other ancient civilizations, the Chinese also defined a center versus barbarians, and the center expand with interaction with the so-called barbarians, who were mostly kind of nomadic people. Many of them were or had been hunter and gatherers, but they were drawn to the kind of agricultural civilization of the center, and as a result, the area of civilization expand, and the kind of geographical area of China also expand with the interaction with the so-called barbarians. So barbarians became civilized, and that the territory of the so-called Chinese civilization also expand in that fashion. To some extent, the character of the river defines the character of the civilization. Yellow River, for example, very different from the Nile River. For the Egyptian civilization, is unpredictable. While the Nile River flood, and that flooding brought fertile soil on which Egyptian civilization was built upon, the flooding of the Yellow River was unpredictable. It brought the lowest plain, those deposit and sand and earth from the lowest, known as the Yellow Earth Plateau, and deposit along its course, and raising the riverbed. So that, after a few centuries, Yellow River flood, and that flooding destroy life instead of creating creating fertile soil for agriculture. So it is a disaster. People rely on Yellow River for navigation, for transportation, and for water. But every couple hundred years, the flooding of Yellow River destroy life. And this map shows, Yellow River, sometimes when it flood, the whole river flow in a different region and change course, basically. And you can only imagine when that happened. It was devastating, and lives were destroyed, farmlands were destroyed, people became homeless, and with nowhere to go and to find help, starving farmers simply rose up, and rebellion would brought the downfall of a dynasty. So that happened every couple hundred years, and usually when that happened, when the Yellow River flood, people became homeless, and uprising broke out all over the country. A dynasty was destroyed, and from that chaos, a new dynasty was born. So the Chinese history is characterized by this kind of periodic dynastic change. And as a result, a concept about the mandate of heaven was developed gradually. So basically, when natural disaster happen, like the flooding of the Yellow River, or a serious drought, or the natural disaster, people interpret that as the gods in heaven disapproving the current ruler, known as the Son of Heaven. So that was interpreted as an omen for the will of God. And the dynastic change was interpreted as the change of mandate of heaven, and the flooding of the Yellow River signaled the first sign for that disapproval of the current Son of Heaven. So we have a long list of dynasties, and most of them last for a couple hundred years, typically like 300 year, 400 year, 200 year, 100 years, etc. So many of them coincide, the rise and the fall of these dynasties coincide with the cycle of the Yellow River. So you can take a look at this list. You obviously don't need to remember all those dates and dynasties, but some of them are more kind of important than other ones. For example, we will look at some buildings from the Han Dynasty. Han Dynasty is very important because it is during Han Dynasty, two of the most important Chinese religions, Confucianism and Taoism, were institutionalized and became some kind of state religion. And Confucianism especially became influential in terms of Chinese society and Chinese governance after the Han Dynasty. Even though Confucianism and Taoism, both as philosophical systems, were founded in the Zhou Dynasty, around the 5th century BCE, in the spring and autumn period of the Zhou Dynasty. But during the Zhou Dynasty, the time of Confucius and Lao Tzu, Confucianism and Taoism were kind of philosophical thoughts among many kind of different thinking systems, philosophical systems, known as the 100 school of thoughts. So it's during the Han Dynasty, many centuries after the passing of Confucius and Lao Tzu, that these religions were became systematic and institutionalized. So we will look at architecture from Han Dynasty, focusing on how Confucianism and Taoism influence the architecture, especially the architecture for the Son of Heaven. And we will also look at the age of disunion, when Buddhism, the third most important traditional Chinese religion, had an impact on the Chinese built environment. And we will look at Tang Dynasty, when this is the time the oldest wooden structure, extant wooden structure was built. There were wooden structures built long before Tang Dynasty, but the oldest we have today, still standing on the Chinese soil, is from the Tang Dynasty, from the 8th century. Song Dynasty is a time of standardization of the Chinese architectural carpentry. So we will look at 营造法式, the building standard published in the Song Dynasty, and how the actual building similar and different from that published standard. The late imperial period of the Ming and the Qing dynasty actually created more than 90% of the extant traditional Chinese architecture that we can directly experience today. So it might not be considered as the greatest age of traditional Chinese architecture, but what we consider as traditional in Chinese architecture is basically defined by what we have still standing today, and those are mostly from the Ming and the Qing dynasty, after the 15th century especially. Before the unification of China into a centralized empire in the 3rd century BCE, China was divided into many smaller states and kingdoms, pretty much like the Greek city-states or Mesopotamian city-states before the Roman Empire, before the Assyrians. So there were many states, even though in the Zhou dynasty there was a Son of Heaven, and acknowledged as the common kind of ruler, like the king of all kings. But the land had never been actually unified before the 3rd century BCE in terms of the language, the measure system, and the writing system. They were not unified. It was starting with the Qin dynasty, under a very powerful ruler, the Qin Shi Huang. So Qin Shi Huang, the founding emperor of the Qin dynasty. So he was the king of Qin state during the Warring States period of the Eastern Zhou dynasty, but he conquered all the other states and unified China. After the unification, Qin Shi Huang adopted a series of, far-reaching policies that had pretty much defined the next 2,000 years of Chinese history. He unified the writing system. So before him, different states used different writing, but he unified that script. He also unified the units of weight, measure, and also the width of the roads. So he defined that the width of streets and avenues in a city need to be of certain width to allow the passing of chariot. So the width of the chariot is also standardized, and as a result, the road system were also standardized. So he was a great unifier. He was most famous for his great architectural project. One is the Great Wall of China, and another one is his own gigantic mausoleum, gigantic tomb. According to the Han Dynasty, 1st century BCE historian Sima Qian, that he enlisted as many as 300,000 people to build the Great Wall, and even more to build his own tomb, 700,000, which is kind of unthinkable. So these two projects together, there are almost 1 million people in total. And if you consider the population of China back then, it was probably no more than 20 million. So kind of 5% of the population. And these are the population, all male labor and, age probably between, 15 and 50. These are young, capable and strong men, which is, if you consider that in terms of the percentage of labors to build these two great architectural project, it is probably 15% of the capable labor of the time. So that actually harmed the dynasty. And Qin dynasty was brought down not because of natural disaster or because of the cycle of the river, but because of the peasant uprising who, were ignited by laborers who were enlisted to build the Great Wall, but then they missed their appointment, and according to the Qin law, they were to be executed. So they went to build the building site of the Great Wall. They would be executed. So they decided to rebel, and that basically ignited the entire empire and brought down the Qin dynasty. So Qin dynasty also gave name China. The name China is from the Qinren, so it has a lasting impact. The Great Wall that from the Qin dynasty didn't survive that well. So these are the 3rd century to 2nd century BC Great Wall. They are mostly in today's desert, Gobi Desert area, survived there, and they were built with rammed earth mostly, and surfaced with bricks at those strategic location. Today, the Great Wall that tourists visit today were actually built in the 15th century, mostly from the Ming Dynasty. So during the Qin Dynasty and the following Han Dynasty, the Great Wall marked the border between agricultural China and the northern barbarians, the nomadic Xiongnu. And during the Ming Dynasty, the 15th century, south of the Great Wall was China, who were mostly farmers, and north of the Great Wall were Mongols. So basically, north of the Great Wall was the homeland of the nomadic people, and south of the Great Wall is the kind of settled, civilized, in quotation mark, China. So it's, Great Wall is usually mentally associated with the Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, but be aware that when you visit the actual Great Wall today on a tourist site, chances are you are visiting a 15th century, not the actual 3rd century BC Great Wall. So this is the 15th century Great Wall. So here we have a group of Northeastern students that I brought on the Dialogue of Civilizations program. I think this one is from 2015, 5 years ago already. Conceptually, it is the legacy of the first emperor. This is the portraiture of the first emperor, and the Great Wall he built today looks more like this rather than this kind of great picturesque iconic image of the Great Wall. So the Great Wall today spans 3,900 miles, and so it's a great distance, equal to the distance between New York and Seattle. And so the labors to build the Great Wall are mostly slave labors. They were, the so-called criminals. The Qin dynasty had a very strict law which produced a lot of criminals, and so they were basically enlisted to build the Great Wall. And one could also become a builder of the Great Wall enlisted in exchange of tax. So that's also the situation. One thing worth remembering is that before the unification of China, there were great walls along the border of many states. The previous ununified China, there were great walls dividing their country. So to some extent, Qin Shi Huang, the great unifier of China, was also a great unifier of the Great Wall. So he didn't build the Great Wall from scratch, from a blank slate. He basically destroyed all the walls, border walls, within the unified Qin Empire, and linked the northern walls, which were previously already been built by the northern states before the unification, like the state of Zhao, state of Yan, and the state of, the Qin state is located here. So there were already a lot of walls to the north. So what the first emperor did was to connect all those and unify the northern Great Wall and link them into a system of defense, while erasing those walls within the currently kind of unified empire of the 3rd century BCE. Without formal archaeological excavation, the first emperor's tomb remained a mystery. Scholars has long been questioning Sima Qian's account of the underground, fantastic depiction of the underground tomb chambers for the first emperor, but a discovery outside the necropolis in the 1970s sweep those doubts away. That discovery was made almost a mile east of the pyramid, the wall for the mausoleum, and that is a famous terracotta army, which is discovered here on the east side. Why on the east side? It is possible that all the enemies for the Qin states were located on the east. The Qin state, before the unification, was the westmost state of China. So all the other states, there were 6 powerful states that were conquered by the first emperor, and they used to be all located to the east. So it's possible that those terracotta armies were buried on the east side to protect the tomb or the spirit of those previous 6 states kings to invade in the afterlife. That discovery proved the grandeur of the first emperor's tomb was beyond our imagination. So it was a huge discovery. Thousands, 6,000. The number kept rising. In the early 2000s, it was 6,000 terracotta army soldiers discovered underground. And now we know there are 8,000 because more were discovered. And there's also a possibility that there might be other terracotta warrior pits in other locations that we simply didn't find them yet. But the first emperor set up a new standard, and that will never be broken. During the following 400 years, Han Dynasty emperors were also buried under kind of truncated pyramid, like this one. This is a tomb for a Han Dynasty emperor, and it is also a pyramid, and the pyramid is also not excavated. It is much smaller than the first empress. And there were also terracotta army unearthed from the Han Dynasty tomb, but those terracotta soldiers were not human size, not life size, not full size, not as grand as the first empress. Their terracotta army, chariot, horses were only about a third of the life size. But Han Dynasty emperors continued the tradition founded by the first emperor, using truncated rammed earth pyramid to bury their sons of heaven. The terracotta army from the first emperor's tomb not only excel in scale but also in quality. Each soldier were given special touch to create individuality, so they do not look alike. So they were also originally painted with natural colors of their armors, cloth or leather, and they also used to hold a real weapon. And they were also specialized, like in a real legion, and forming kind of battle formation, and they were all life-size. So when they were newly created, almost 2,300 years ago, standing in front of such a terracotta army, one would feel they were facing a real army. They were made to be real, to at least look real, and not to be displayed in museum for people to appreciate, to bury underground, not meant to be seen at all. So the idea is basically to serve afterlife. And I should say this is a huge improvement in terms of civilization development, because before the Qin dynasty, human sacrifice was widely practiced. This is the tomb from Shang dynasty, and Shang dynasty was from roughly 1600 BCE to about 1146 to about 1046 BCE. So during the Shang dynasty, the rulers were buried in underground chambers, the pit, and then the surrounding shallower but wider pits has skeletons, and there were skeletons of human being. There were also skeletons of horses and real chariot buried in sacrificial pits surrounding the tomb. So human sacrifice was widely practiced in the Shang dynasty and in the Zhou dynasty as well. So even though the first emperor was kind of infamous due to the atrocity he brought to his people, and he was also criticized for destroying Confucian classics and burying scholars alive, kind of try to control the vast empire more efficiently and destroy whoever stand in front of him to prevent himself from achieving that unification. He at least did not sacrifice human in the scale as the earlier rulers, and he used these replicas in terracotta, in bronze, and something that could be put in a museum for kind of enjoyment of later generations. Not his intention, but human sacrifice was not widely practiced anymore in the Qin dynasty. And this tomb from Eastern Han dynasty is interesting because it reminded me some medieval European architecture where you find the redundancy of having a arch and then a post lintel kind of put together. So here we have a true arch and a beautifully carved semicircular panel with fantastic animal of dragon and tiger representing east and west. So the axis of the tomb is a north-south axis. And then there is a column supporting that panel, and the column was carved in plant motif underneath and animal motif on the top. So there's also a kind of capital-like abacus making the transition between the column and the lintel. But they are inscribed within this arch. And so the Chinese were capable of building masonry structure using arch and vault. But for some reason, they just reserve that technology for underground space. They use it either for spiritual purposes, like for tomb, and later for Buddhist pagodas, or for purely utilitarian functions. For example, bridges. In some old Chinese bridge, the arch were also used. But throughout the the imperial history of China, wood remained the major architectural material, and that seemingly most simplistic building structural system was developed into a very complicated system. The possibility was explored to its extreme, and that would produce the future great architectures in the later dynasties, building, palaces, temples, and sacrificial halls, etc. Han Dynasty institutionalized philosophy and state ideology, emphasized the union of the three realms of heaven, human world, and earth, especially after the 1st century scholar Dong Zhongshu. So this thought later considered Confucianism, but it really, excuse me, blend a lot of earlier thoughts from the Eastern Zhou period, from the time of Confucius and Mencius. So it was a mixture, a blending. But this state ideology highlight the interaction of heaven and human, and created a system that link everything together. For example, the East is associated with a color and has its own symbolic meaning, and it was also assigned a season, and it belonged to the element of wood. So the 5 elements were paired up with the 4 direction and the center, and this 5 element was used to explain everything. For example, each of the 5 notes of musical scale were also assigned an element, and thus tied to a specific season and specific color. The 5 internal organs, the 5 senses, etc., etc. So this system basically made a universal connection of everything, made the seemingly unrelated thing, for example, the human heart and the element wood and the spring, how are they connected? But they are connected in this system. So in terms of architecture, we found those roof tile, the tile ends that are marked with the 4 symbolic animal of east, north, west, and south. The east being the blue dragon, west the white tiger, the north the dark warrior, or the black turtle, and the south is the red phoenix. So they belong to ceremonial ritual architecture that were highly symbolic and ritualistic, and these architectural decoration were used on different cardinal direction to decorate the cardinal direction of roof of each direction. Documents from the Zhou dynasty had been mentioning the architecture of Ming Tang. So this architecture, it was said that Ming Tang belonged to the Son of Heaven in the Zhou dynasty documents. So what exactly is Ming Tang? We don't really know, but there were a lot of discussion, a lot of discourse going on around the Ming Tang. We know that during the Han Dynasty, scholars were already debating about the what exactly a Zhou Dynasty Ming Tang looked like. and the Tang Dynasty, when the female ruler, Empress Wu, wanted to consolidate her status as the son of heaven. She declared herself as the son of heaven, which certainly needs some kind of legitimation. And she also built a Mingtang, and to claim that she was the rightful son of heaven. She held the mandate of heaven. So there was a lot of mystery, a lot of discussion about Mingtang. We don't really know what it looked like, but we know exactly what the Zhou dynasty, son of heaven, was supposed to do in this building. The Zhou dynasty Mingtang was a four-sided structure in which the emperor moves from hall to hall according to different seasons, adjusting the states with the cycle of nature. It was simultaneously a religious center, a administrative center, and an education center as well. Edicts were issued there. Specific orders were given from the Son of Heaven in Mingtang, and it was certainly a sacrificial center, first and foremost, a ritual center. But in the late imperial time, the Son of Heaven also gave a lecture to the imperial university students. So it was also kind of having a educational function. Let me see. So I should say that previously we have no idea about what Mingtang looked like, even though there were a lot of words, a lot of depiction about it. But a 20th century discovery of the Han Dynasty Mingtang give us a very good idea. So this is the Han Dynasty Mingtang discovered in the Xi'an, which was located to the south of the Han Dynasty capital city of Chang'an, and it features a series of circle and square. So there's a circular ditch, a ring of water. Within that circle is a square courtyard. The square courtyard had gates marking the four cardinal direction and air-shaped corner towers. And then located in the center of the square is a low kind of platform raised from the ground. And then within that circle is another square, that square complex. And some scholar believe that located the uppermost floor of the central building is a circular roof with a pointed end. So it features a series of intersecting circle and square. And in the Chinese cosmology, heaven is circular and the earth is square. So it symbolizes the interaction between heaven and earth. And between heaven and earth is the human world. This is known as the three worthies, heaven, human, and earth. So a layout like this is suitable for the Son of Heaven to perform ritual performance, that acting as the intermediate between heaven and earth. So the Son of Heaven is the representative of heaven to rule the earth. So at the site of the Han Dynasty Mingtang, archaeologists discovered a complex that has a rammed earth core on the first and the second level. This is the plan of the second level. And So first and second level, there's an earth core, and then the third level was raised above this kind of earth platform, and featuring a central pavilion on the top. Some archaeologists reconstructed that as a square building, but others reconstructed that the top building as a circular, kind of cylindrical room with a kind of conical roof. It features 4 major halls on the 4 cardinal direction, which symbolize the 4 seasons. And the east represent spring, south represent summer, west represent autumn, and north represent winter. But outside of that big room, there are 3 smaller rooms on each side, and each one represent a month. So a season has 3 months. So in total, there are 4 major chambers representing 4 seasons, and 12 smaller rooms attached to it, to them, to represent the 12-month cycle of a year. Let me read a section from the Book of Rites. So in the Book of Rites, in one famous volume, so this is the section 1, book 4, from the Book of Rites, called the Yue Ling. It says, in the first month of spring, the sun is in Shi, the star culminating at dusk being Zhan, and that culminating at dawn, Wei. Its day are Jia and Yi. Its divine ruler is Tai Hao, and attending spirit is Gao Mang. Its creature are the scaly. Its musical note is Jiao, and its pitch tube is the Tai Chu. Its number is 8. Its taste is sour. Its smell is rank. Its sacrifice is that at the door, and of the parts of the victim, the spleen has the foremost place. The east wind resolves the cold. Creatures that have been torpid during the winter begin to move. The fishes rise up to the ice. Otters sacrifice fish. The wild geese make their appearance. The Son of Heaven occupies the apartment on the left of the Qingyang, which is, the first room on the spring side. Continue to quote, rise in the carriage with the phoenix spell, drawn by the azure dragon horse, and carrying the green flag, wears the green robe and the pieces of green jade on his cap and at his girdle pendant. He eats meat and mutton. The vessels which he uses are slightly carved to resemble the shooting forth of plants. And it goes on more, talking about, during that month, the first month of spring, the Son of Heaven, what the Son of Heaven need to do. In that specific room that belonged to the first month of spring, and its color certainly match the symbolic color of the east, blue and green. And the same book also talk about if the Son of Heaven failed to do this, then all kinds of natural disaster would happen. So what does this mean? This means that by performing ritual coincide with the cycle of a year, the Son of Heaven was performing his duty to be an intermediate between the heaven and earth. So this is the building for ritualistic performance to consolidate the power of the Son of Heaven, for the building that allows all kind of ritualistic performance to legitimize the status of Son of Heaven, to tell his people that this guy held the mandate of heaven. He was the rightful ruler. But if he failed to perform that, then he was not, lost the favor of heaven maybe, and then people would uprise. And the mandate of heaven might change, and a new dynasty might be founded to choose a new kind of lineage of Son of Heavens. So this is the significance of Mingtang. It is, we know that building type continued at least from the Zhou dynasty. And in addition to those key, month and at a specific turning point of the cycle, Earth cycle, the Son of Heaven also need to perform something special. For example, during winter solstice, he also need to pray to heaven and occupy the top room and pray to heaven, and also allegedly receiving orders from heaven. And after that, he would, he would issue the calendar for the next year. So the calendar, of course, is very important because the calendar will tell the agricultural society when to sow the seeds, when to plow, and when to harvest. So it was this kind of ritual performance certainly was a very, very significant matter in the ancient world, for which one rely pretty much on the weather to get enough food. So but Mingtang as a major architectural type simply was not constructed anymore after the Tang Dynasty. Empress Wu of Tang in the 8th century CE, late 7th century, early 8th century CE, was the last major construction and discussion of Mingtang we have ever heard of. So where did this architectural type go after the Tang Dynasty? The functionality of Mingtang was later shouldered among a series of ritual architecture in the late imperial period, in the medieval and late imperial period in China. While during the Han Dynasty and Zhou Dynasty, all those sacrifices were made in the Mingtang, and major ritualistic performance to hold the mandate of heaven were performed in Mingtang. Later, they were dispersed in a series of different ritual architectures. For example, there were sacrifices made to heaven, and that is in the Temple of Heaven, and the sacrifice to Earth had its separate complex and buildings. There was also sacrifice to Moon, to Sun, sacrifice to the Sun. So they all had different buildings. So to some extent, these architecture were the descendants of the pre-Han Dynasty Mingtang. For example, the Temple of Heaven in Beijing also had that characteristic interlocking combination of square and circle. So this is the Temple of Heaven, where the Son of Heaven came to make sacrifice to heaven during winter solstice, and that is also a very important ritualistic performance to declare the mandate of heaven. And so later Son of Heavens still need to continue this ritualistic performance to claim the mandate of heaven, even though there was not a Mingtang anymore. Buildings like sacrificial buildings like the Temple of Heaven shouldered that function. The most famous building at the Temple of Heaven is the hall for prayers for a good year. So it's this building. It's a kind of three-leveled roof. The roof has 3 eaves. It does not mean it has 3 interior space. It's basically just one big room, and the 3 roofs just added symbolic significance to the building. So the sacrifice to heaven was made at the altar of heaven, which is to the south of the hall for prayers for good years, which you can see in the distance. So here, number 3 featured. So you have 3 layers of platforms, 3 eaves for the roof, etc. and etc. So number 3 was pivotal in the symbolism in the Temple of Heaven, and same as number 9. And that is probably had something to do with the concept of heaven, human world, and earth, and that the Son of Heaven was the one to connect the 3. He was the representative of heaven to rule the human world on earth.